MDX is one of the best and easiest ways to manage content as a developer, but what's not always easy is figuring out how to source that MDX content in the first place. Now, I'm trying to create a web version of my 50 React projects ebook where I want to be able to take all the existing projects, I want to show an individual page for each of them, and I even want to have a big list of them so someone can browse around and figure out which project that they're interested in. Now, all this content is stored as MDX. So how can I source this MDX content and actually display it in the page? So we're going to see how we can do this inside of a Next.js app, and we're going to see how I can take all these existing files of MDX that I have it all written out, how I can create dynamic routes for each of them, and even list out all those files to a nice browsable list. Now, speaking of React projects, I have an upcoming full stack Next.js 15 course where we'll walk through authentication, database management, and even how to accept payments. So make sure you sign up below at spacejelly.dev/nextjs to get exclusive access and updates for the upcoming course. Now, starting off inside of my app, I already created this projects page where I want to be able to list out all my MDX content. Now, looking inside of the code, we can see that it's a pretty standard page. There's nothing really special going on. But if we scroll down, we can see that I currently have all of my projects stored inside of this projects directory. And we can see that it's pretty typical MDX. I have some front matter, I have some components that I'm importing, and then just generally speaking, I'm just managing my content from within that. Now, starting from the top, I want to figure out how I can actually start to source this content inside of Next.js. Now, the nice thing is we have some official packages to make it nice and easy to work with Markdown and MDX inside of Next.js, where we have an official Next.mdx package. We have a few MDX.js official packages that we need to install. We just need to add a little bit of configuration to our Next.js config, and then just add this MDX components file, which is going to allow us to customize the components that get used when we're generating that MDX content. So let's do just that. I'm going to go ahead and copy the install dependencies. I'm going to go ahead and install those dependencies inside of my app. I'm now going to grab that Next.js configuration where for starts, I'm just going to go ahead and copy it as is. And I'm going to go ahead and copy that or paste that right into my next config file and hide my sidebar here to give us a little extra room. We can see here that it's using the import statement. So I'm going to switch that up and use it as require. So let's go ahead and add const mdx equals require. Or of course I could switch that up and use import for the other one and change the file extension, but I'm just going to go with my existing configuration. We can see that I need to add the page extensions inside of the next config. Let's get rid of all that. And then finally, I need to wrap it with the with MDX for the actual configuration. So what I can do is I can add this right above the module exports. I'm just going to wrap what I'm already wrapping with plausible proxy so that I can get each of those plugins working inside of my config. Now, just to make sure that this is still working, I'm going to run npm run dev, and the page reloads, and we can see that it's still actually working. Now, the other thing that I need to add is this mdx components.tsx file. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the contents of that, and we can see that it's instructing us to add it inside where it's the same level as our pages or app directory. So it's going to be inside of the source directory if we're using the source directory. Otherwise, it's going to be in the root if you're not using the source. So in my project, I am using the source directory. So let's clap this down just to kind of visualize this. Right next to my middleware file, I'm going to add the mdx.components.tsx file, and then I'm going to drop in what I copied from the docs. Now, as far as rendering MDX pages, the way that it's instructing inside the documentation is it's pretty much just like any other page. We can see here from the file structure here that we're pretty much going to have the folder name, which is going to be our route name, and then we're going to have page.mdx or md. Now, as we saw before, I currently have a separate directory of all my projects, and each of them have their own individual MDX file with their own individual name. It's not nested in that directory and page.tsx or MDX file pattern. So the first thing I'm going to do is move all these files over into the App Router directory so that I can actually start working with them inside of there. So we can see inside of my projects folder where I want to have these live, I'm going to create a new folder, and let's add this as an organizational route first. Let's call that content. And then inside of there, this is where I'm going to add all those files. Now let's copy all these. I'm going to go ahead and select them all. And I'm going to copy them over because we're going to come back and do something a little different afterwards. But first of all, I'm going to go ahead and copy all these into that content directory, where now for each of these files, I need them to exist as a folder, again, with that page.tsx file. Now, I didn't want to try to write that out by hand, so I went ahead and just asked Claude to write that kind of script for me, where I'm basically just saying that I want to move each of those files into a folder of its own name and then rename the file to page.mdx. So let's go ahead and try to paste that into my source app projects, projects, and then I have my projects, and then again, I have the content inside of there, and then I'm going to go ahead and run that script. It should have already worked, and I can see that I do have all those directories. And if I actually look inside of my IDE, we can see that each of them are now named as page.mdx. So that should have worked perfectly. All right, so then let's just use that blog as the example page here. Let's go over to the browser, and if I go to project/blog, we can see that the page did render, but it looks a little messed up. We can see that I have this front matter sticking at the top of the page. Now, Next.js's MDX solution doesn't support front matter by default, and we can see here that they do list out a few solutions that we could use to try to figure that out. But before we go any further, I want to actually use a different solution here. Part of my personal preference is I don't want to manage all my MDX content in this nested structure. Now, I got used to that App Router solution for things like maybe a getting started page or, the one-off pages. They have more complicated layout solutions and all that stuff. But for my MDX, I'd rather just have a flat directory with all my MDX files inside of it. I feel like that's a little bit more ergonomical for my purposes. Now, if you don't care about the front matter and you're happy with how it's rendering as is, this is still a good solution for being able to get up and running with that content very quickly inside of the typical Next.js environment. Maybe you do want to have complex layout solutions or use some of the more baked in App Router features to manage that content. But for me, I just want it to be all the same page and I want to manage it a little bit differently. Now, if you've managed MDX content in the Pages router before, you might already be familiar with this package, next-mdx-remote, which gives us more of a way to manage, quote, remote MDX content, where inside of a separate directory is a good way of remote content, or maybe you're fetching it from an external source. But either way, this is going to give us another way in order to manage that content, where I want to have that projects directory of all my MDX content and import it into my project. Now, originally this was developed for the Pages router, but it does support the App Router now, where we can see that it has a few different APIs in order to allow us to do that, including this MDX remote component, which comes from the RSC package or module. So to start, I'm just going to clean things back up. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that content directory. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that MDX components file. And I'm going to also npm uninstall all those original packages. So now I want to go ahead and install the MDX remote package. So let's go ahead and copy next-mdx-remote, npm install that one. Where now let's head back into the App Router into my projects directory, where I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call that project slug, which is going to be my dynamic route. And inside of that, I'm going to create my page.tsx file, which is going to be where I'm going to create my individual page for each project. Now let's just for now copy all that content from the projects page itself so that we can start to set this up. But the way that this is going to work is I'm going to actually use the fs module in order to read those files from the file system or inside of the app project so that I can grab those and render out the content. So at the top, I'm going to import fs from fs, or rather promises as fs from fs. Then we're going to say constant content equals await fs read file. And then I'm going to use path to actually build the path of where those files are. So I'm going to import path from path, and I'm going to say, let's hide the sidebar here, path join, where I'm going to use process.cwd, which is the current working directory, which is basically going to grab wherever this process is running. So I can grab that as the base path, and then I can append it wherever that is inside of the project. So I'm going to say that that's going to current working directory, spelled that wrong. I'm going to then add the source app projects, which is where all those projects are going to be. And then finally, I'm going to want to add the page slug for wherever that's going to be. Now, I know one to start is blog. So let's just add for now blog.mdx so that we have an example to work with. And for now, let's just console log out content to make sure that this is actually working. And when I try to start up the server, we can see that it actually wasn't working. I think I defined my path wrong, where inside here, it's actually in source projects, not inside the app directory. And looks like I also forgot to clean it out of my Next.js config file. So I'm going to go ahead and also rip that out. Otherwise, I'll still get an error. But now if I reload the page, we can see that I do get that content console logged into my terminal, but we can see that it says a buffer, and it looks like I just didn't specify the encoding right. So one thing that I forgot is under the read file method, I also need to specify UTF-8, if I spell it right. But now if I refresh the page, we can see that I do now get that MDX content right inside of my terminal, which is exactly what we need. Okay, so back to the docs, we can see that we can import this MDX remote component, and then we can render it as our source. So let's give that a try. So at the top of my file, I'm going to import that MDX remote component, and let's inside of this article, I guess, let's do MDX remote, and as the source, that's going to be our content. And we can get rid of that console log now, and let's get rid of this H1 for now. And if we head back into the page, we can see that we actually get this error. It says that it's looking for this checklist component to be defined. Now, part of my MDX is I have a bunch of components in there that are being used, so I need to make sure MDX remote is aware of those components. Now, in order to set that up, all we need to do is define a components prop, which is going to be an object of the components that we want to import and use. So I'm going to specify components equals an empty object. Let's use the blog as an example here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab all these import statements, head back up to the top, import these in here. Let me just grab all these by just their name. Then inside of the components, I'm going to go ahead and paste those in, add a comma after each one of those. And once that's done, we can see just like that, we now have that content, and it looks like we still have that same issue as we had with the native MDX or Next.js way. We had that front matter not being read, but we are seeing that content being rendered. So at least we're making progress here. Now, as far as front matter goes, MDX Remote's component doesn't support that by default, but what does support that is a different function that's available inside of that package as this compile MDX function. So we're going to import and use that one instead, which is going to allow us to simultaneously render that into a variable that we can dump inside the page as that content, but also get that front matter content. So let's grab that compile MDX function, and I'm going to grab it from the package. And then let's at the top here, I'm going to say constant. We can do a similar thing of content. And then instead of my file, I'm going to go ahead and import that at the top. And then we can go ahead and now create data just as a starting point. And we can say await compile MDX, where that's going to take an object where our source is going to be that same content. We're going to pass an options object, which is going to be parse front matter true. And then again, just to make sure we're testing things out, let's go ahead and console log out our data object. And we can see if we go back to the terminal, we do have that front matter readily available inside of a JavaScript object, as well as the content, which we can see that it's a React element. So now we can render that directly in the page. So I'm going to go ahead and now remove this MDX remote and replace it with data.content, which again is going to be that React component. And I'm going to go ahead and add back in that H1 that I had before, but now I'm going to add it as data.frontmatter.title, which is going to come from that front matter. Now, as we can see that we're getting a TypeScript error because it's not familiar with all the different front matter types that we're going to actually have. So what we can do, and what we saw inside of the example here, is we can add that type to the compile MDX function, where we can just do a very similar thing since it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be our title. And if we scroll down, we can see that that was now resolved. And the only other thing that we need to do now is go back and add those components like we did before. So I'm going to go ahead, add my components as that object. And I probably shouldn't have deleted this part from last time, but I can go ahead and just simply copy those again right inside. I can add my comma, and we can see that the content is rendering inside. And we can see that I do already have an H1 in there, so I probably don't need double H1s there for that title. But now I can use that title for other things, such as my metadata that I want to generate on the fly. But before we get to the metadata generation, let's go ahead and just wrap this up real quick, where I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that H1 since we already have it. Alternatively, I can remove all the H1s from the actual MDX content itself so that I have more flexibility of using that inside of the front matter. It's really just a preference of where you're going to store that H1, whether it's inside the content or as front matter. And I think that's looking pretty good now. But as far as generating that metadata, we have two different options for how we handle metadata inside of a Next.js project, where we can either export this constant, which is just a static object like I'm doing now, but we can also export an async function. Let me make sure that I spell async right. An async function called generate metadata. We can return an object just similarly to what we did with this metadata object, but this time what we're going to do is we're going to grab that using the same kind of method as we did to grab the content in the first place, and then use that to generate the metadata. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste this as is right to the top here. I'm going to get rid of the components because we don't actually want to render the content. All we want here is the front matter. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. And then I can grab the front matter from that data. And for the title, I can say, I want my front matter.title, and let's say 50 React projects. Now, also, I want to make sure that I get rid of that static object that I was already defining. And it looks like I made another typo here. It's not metadata, it's metadata. And if we look at the top here, we can see that my title here now has blog and then 50 React projects. Now it looks like I was managing the metadata inside of the content in another way using title templates. So I don't actually need that 50 React projects here. So let's just go ahead and get rid of that because I forgot that I was doing that way. So if I just add just the data itself, we can see that it's blog 50 React projects. Where the way that I was able to do that title template was inside of my layout, I have my metadata defined where the title uses the template field where I can specify the dynamic content and then whatever I want to go after that, so that no matter what page I am, I can make sure that I add that dynamic value, and then it always ends with the site name. Now this is perfect. The only thing we need to do now is make this dynamic, because if you remember, we're statically adding blog. So no matter what we go to, if we go to ASDF, it's still going to show that blog. So just like any dynamic route, if you're familiar with the concept, the way that this is going to work is we're going to grab the params or parameters that are passed into the page component. Now, this is going to come dynamically from the folder that we defined before with the brackets, which means that this is a dynamic route. So we're going to grab this project slug from the params. So I'm going to go ahead and destructure params. I'm going to type this out as params, and that's going to be my project slug, which will be a string. And then once I have these params, I'm going to use the params.project slug value in order to dynamically get the actual project content that I want. So I'm going to go ahead and take this value, and we can see that instead of the blog here, I'm going to pass this in dynamically. So I'm going to have project slug.mdx. And inside of the browser, we should immediately see that if you tried to also go to ASDF, that it's not going to work because that file doesn't exist. But let's go back to blog. First of all, we can see that it's now rendering as a page. And let's try something else, such as conference schedule. We can see that we now get that conference schedule content dynamically from that MDX file. Now, as far as the metadata that we need to generate, this is going to work exactly the same way. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the params that we already defined. I'm going to pass that into generate metadata. Said that weird. And then I'm going to paste in the params.project slug. Let me hide myself here, the params.project slug, to similarly get that same MDX file dynamically. And we can see that the meta title is also updating to reflect whatever page we're on, whether that is the conference blog or e-commerce store. We can see that it's dynamically going to change based on that content. But now we have all of our dynamic pages ready for all of our different MDX content pages in our projects. So now let's figure out a way that we can actually run a list of these so people can easily navigate to them. So what I want to do is on the project's top level page here, I want to just simply dump out all the projects. So we're going to do something somewhat similarly to what we're doing inside of each of the dynamic routes, and we're going to use fs, but this time we're going to use fs to read the directory, and then we're going to get the file names of all those where we can then send them. So back inside of that projects page, let's go ahead and hide the sidebar. I'm going to import promises as fs from fs and import path from path, or rather make sure that I add the quotes around there. But then inside of the project, I'm going to say constant file names is equal to await fs read dir. And inside of there, I want to pass that path dynamically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the same thing that I did from inside of the project slug file. I'm going to grab that path, paste it inside of redirectory, but this time I'm going to get rid of that dynamic MDX file because I only want the directory name for this. Because remember, we want to get all the files, not just a single file. So let's go ahead and console log out the file names here. And once the page reloads, we can see that I now have all these MDX files that I can now use in order to create that list. So now I need to get the content for each of those so I can access the front matter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say constant projects is equal to await, where I'm going to use promise.all so that inside there, I can just map through all the different file names so that I can grab the content for each one. So I'm going to say file names.map, and I'm going to pass in an async function where it's going to be that file, or let's use file name rather. File name. And then I'm going to do the same thing that I did inside of the other project. So what I need to do now is let's first copy over the existing logic that we have from inside the project or the dynamic route. I'm going to paste that inside of this map statement. But now I need to make sure I use that file name, that dynamic file name, in order to be able to source that file. So let's go ahead and use that file name right here instead of the project slug.mdx, which was dynamically added before, because that file name, if we remember from the terminal, is only going to be that slug or project name.mdx. So that's going to be perfect. We're going to have the source projects and that file name. We're going to read that file. We're then going to pass that into compile MDX, which we can import into the project. That's going to give us back that front matter. And now let's just simply return that front matter, or rather that front matter. I'm going to go, I can't spell that. And I'm also going to pass in that file name just in case we ever need it in the future. So as I usually like to do, let's go ahead and console log this out to make sure that we're on the right path. But if I reload the page, we can now see in the terminal that I do get an array of objects with all that information we need. And we can see we get that title. We still get that file name because we're passing it through. We're getting a description, which we can show on the page to get people excited about particular projects and, you know, what generally to expect. But the thing that we don't have here is we don't have a slug. And the slug is going to be what we're going to actually use in the path. Because if we pass them to the file name, for instance, the MDX isn't going to be accepted because that's not as part of the path structure. Now, thankfully, that's a simple fix. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another field of slug, and we're going to just simply say file name, replace, where we're going to have .mdx and replace it with simply nothing, and then make sure add a comma. And we can see that now we have that slug, which is going to be perfect for how we actually link each of these projects. So back inside, I want to go ahead and start looping through all these projects. So I'm going to say projects.map, and for each project, I'm going to go ahead and return a list item. I'm going to make sure that I wrap this within an ordered list, of course. And then once I have that, let's just add the project.title. We can add that inside of an H3. I think that probably makes sense, giving the hierarchy of the page, and then a paragraph, which has the project.description. And before we even add any styles, description, did I spell that right? I'm realizing that I never added that to the type of compile MDX. If we remember from the top here, where is it? Compile MDX. It only knows about the title right now. So that's why we're getting that type error. So let's also add description, which you probably should break this out into its own type as you're passing this along and probably abstracting these methods. But we can see that that's happy now. Let's make sure that we add the key so that React doesn't, so that React doesn't shout. We can add the project.filename just so it has something. And we can see that while it's not pretty, we do have all of our projects. We have analytics, apples to apples. We have everything listed out. So now all we need to do is style it up a little bit and then add the links. So I'm not going to go crazy here. Let's just do something simple. Let's just say class name equals text. Let's do 3XL and then maybe class name text XL, or maybe just large, but add font bold for the title. And then in order to give some space between each one, let's just make this grid and then gap. Let's just say 6. I also want to make sure that I give a hint of margin underneath or between the H3 and the paragraph tag. So let's do margin bottom. Let's just say 2. And I think this is looking a lot better. We now are able to easily read all the different projects and see the description for each one. Now, if we wanted to take this further, maybe we can add some more styles. I can add a shadow, rounded. I can even add some padding here. So how about PX4, PY3, and then maybe for the grid, I'm going to make this grid calls 2 so that it's going to be 2 grids or, for each of these cards. And I think that's looking pretty good too. We now have cards for each of these. Maybe it's a little bit more condensed so that we can scroll through these. But now we need a way to actually link these to the individual projects. So now I'm going to go ahead and just use the link element. I'm going to go ahead and wrap all this content. I'm actually going to take the shadow, the rounded, and the padding, and I'm going to actually apply that to the link tag because I don't want the link to actually be padded inside of that container. I want to be able to make that whole card clickable. Otherwise, we'll have that gap on the side, which will be a little bit confusing. I'm going to also make that a block element to make sure that it does fill up all that space. It looks like I double pasted that class name in there. And then all I need is that href, which the href is going to be the dynamic route. So that's going to be /projects. And then it's going to be the project.slug that we added by replacing the MDX from the file name. Now, the only thing left now is to actually import that link. So that's going to be import link from next link. But if I now head back to my projects page, we can see that they are looking like clickable links. If I go ahead and click through to something like budget manager, we can see that I was taken to that budget manager page and it's rendering perfectly. And we can go to anything else. Let's go to dark mode. We can see that we now have the ability to render out all those MDX files dynamically by grabbing that all from the file system. Now, the nice thing is this gives you 2 good ways in order to render that MDX content, whether you want to render it remotely from that separate folder like I'm doing. That's just my personal preference of how I organize it. Or if you want to create that typical project structure that's going the app router way, where we have that nested file name and then the file or page.mdx. Both ways are going to work perfectly fine for when you're trying to build your content site driven by MDX. Now, as far as my use case goes, another thing that I would want to do is probably group these by topic. Because each of these projects are broken down into a specific category, maybe on this page we have the different category names and then have all the projects listed under. Now, I'm not going to walk through that, but let's see if you can do that on your own. But let's take this a step up and see how we can build this into a full stack Next.js app, where maybe we want to wrap it with authentication, so you have to log in to be able to see it. Or maybe we want to accept payments because this is premium content. Make sure you sign up below at spacejelly.dev/nextjs to get updates and exclusive access. Now, if you have hundreds of projects or even thousands of projects or blog posts, you probably don't want to list this all in one page. You probably want to use pagination.